All right, let's dive into one of the most persistent and, let's be honest, explosive questions of our time. Is there some kind of inherent link between religion and violence? We're going to go way beyond the headlines, look at the texts, the data, and see what it all really tells us. Let's get into it.
So, this is the big one, right? The central question that our source material really digs into. It's a heavy accusation, and it's one we see fueled by news headlines and some truly tragic events. To really get our heads around it, we've got to look at it from three angles: the data, the religious texts themselves, and the human element behind it all.
And it's super important to remember this isn't some new conversation. The source makes a point of saying that this label, inherently violent, has been thrown at a lot of different religions over the centuries. It's part of a much bigger, much older critique that says religion itself is one of the main drivers of human conflict. Okay, so let's tackle the accusation head-on. To even begin to understand the argument, we have to acknowledge the very real violence that fuels this whole perception. The conversation, for most people, starts with the headlines and the statistics. Look, we can't just ignore the real-world violence committed by groups who claim they're doing it for religious reasons. From 9/11 to the October 7th attack by Hamas, the number of lives lost is just staggering. And it turns out a very small number of extremist groups are responsible for the huge majority of terrorism deaths. But here is the absolutely crucial point that the data shows, one that almost always gets lost in the noise. The main victims of this violence, by a huge margin, it's other Muslims.
Now, let's try to put those acts of violence into perspective with some hard numbers. First up, this one, 1.9 billion. That's roughly how many Muslims there are in the world today.
Okay, so keep that 1.9 billion in your head. Now compare it to this number. The source gives a high-end estimate for fighters in groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda at around 230,000. And here's what that looks like when you put them side by side. I mean, wow, that top estimate of extremist fighters, it represents just 0.01% of all Muslims on the planet. To put it another way, the data is telling us that 99.99% of Muslims are not part of these violent extremist groups.
But we all know the argument isn't just about numbers and statistics, right? It almost always comes down to the words written in the holy books themselves. So, now let's shift gears from the people to the pages. This is it. This is the Quran's so-called sword verse, and it gets brought up constantly as Exhibit A for the religion's supposedly violent nature. I mean, if you just pull it out and look at it on its own, it sounds like a pretty clear command for violence. Both critics of the religion and extremists use verses just like this one to build their case. So what do you do with a verse like that? How are you supposed to approach it? Well, the source suggests a kind of toolkit. Three key things to keep in mind. First, you have to consider the context. What was actually happening in the world when this was written? Second, you can't just cherry pick. You've got to read a passage as part of the whole book. And third, it's really helpful to compare it to other holy books. You have to ask, are violent passages really unique to just this one text?
And this slide really shows the danger of that cherry picking. For every sword verse in the Quran, you can find one like this, which says that saving a single life is like saving all of humanity. And on the flip side, you can open the New Testament and find Jesus quoted as saying, "I came not to send peace, but a sword." The point is, you can find passages in pretty much any religious text that can be read as either peaceful or violent. Defining a whole faith by just one type of verse means you're missing the forest for the trees.
So this leads us to something bigger than just single verses. It's about interpretation. How are the core ideas inside a faith actually understood by the people who follow it?
Let's take the word jihad. We've all heard it, and it's almost always translated as holy war. But our source makes it clear that for the vast majority of Muslims and Islamic scholars, the primary meaning is the internal, spiritual struggle to be a good person and to resist doing wrong. Now, the idea of an armed, external jihad does exist, but it's traditionally seen as a secondary meaning, and one that is strictly limited to acts of self-defense.
And this brings up a really crucial argument from the source, that we have to look at the political angle. Very often, extremist groups are just using religious language as a powerful tool to get what they really want, which, at its core, is political: gaining power, controlling land, and getting people to join them. From this perspective, theology is just a convenient cover for plain old worldly ambition.
All right, so we've talked about the numbers, we've talked about the texts, but what about people? What does all this look like in the real world through actual lived experience?
This is where the author of the source material gets personal. He tells a story about spending 2 years living in Indonesia, which happens to have the largest Muslim population on Earth, and his experience on the ground just completely flew in the face of the narrative of fear. He said it was just normal, peaceful, everyday life.
And it wasn't just that they were peaceful. He says the people he met there would constantly and forcefully reject extremist groups. He heard the phrase, "they are not really Muslim," over and over again. And that really highlights this deep divide. For them, what the terrorists were doing was a total corruption of their faith, not an expression of it.
So, how do we bring all of this together? We've gone from huge global statistics to specific lines in a book, and then all the way down to one-on-one interactions. What's the big takeaway here? Well, it all boils down to something really practical, something about how we actually manage to live together. The source basically argues that to assume your neighbor's religion commands them to be violent isn't just wrong based on the data and a careful reading of the text, it's also a terrible foundation for building any kind of peaceful community.
And so all of this really leaves us with one final big question to think about. Whether we're talking about the Quran, the Bible, or any other important text, is the meaning just locked into the words on the page? Or is the real meaning found in the choices we make, the context we bring, and the humanity we use when we decide how to read them?